Selfish, okay.
Good word.
We usually notice when somebody else is selfish, but we don't notice when we're being selfish, do we? There's one man in the Bible who wrote about his own selfishness. Many of you probably heard of him. Do you know his name? If I told you he met a gigantic fish, then would you know his name? Jonah, there you go. We're going to read what Jonah wrote about himself in what we call the book of Jonah, which can be found in the Bible about halfway between the book of Daniel and the New Testament book of Matthew. And right after Amos and Obadiah. So, the word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me. So the people of Nineveh didn't know about the real God. They had statues that they called gods. Verses 2 and 3 here. But go to the great, let's see here, yeah. But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for that port. After paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord. Why do you think Jonah wanted to run away from God?
He didn't want to go there.
You didn't want to go to Nineveh, huh? Why do you think he didn't want to go to Nineveh?
Because this man says this.
Because what? And what was yours?
I didn't like them.
He didn't like them. He didn't like the Ninevites. Well, they were different. They weren't from his family. They weren't from the people of Israel, so that could be true. I think so. Verses 4 through 10. Then the Lord sent a great wind on the sea, and such a violent storm that the ship threatened to break up. All the sailors were afraid, and they each cried out to his own god. See, they had made up gods too. And they threw the cargo into the sea to lighten the ship. But Jonah had gone below deck, where he lay down and fell into a deep sleep. The captain went to him and said, "How can you sleep? Get up and call on your God. Maybe he will take notice of us, and we will not perish." Then the sailors said to each other, "Come, let's cast lots to find out who is responsible for this calamity." They cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. So they asked him, "Tell us, who's responsible for making all this trouble for us? What do you do? What country do you come from, or where do you come from? What is your country? From what people are you?" He answered, "I am a Hebrew, and worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the land." This terrified them, and they asked, "What have you done?" They knew he was running away from the Lord because he'd already told them that. So these people, these sailors that had fake gods, they didn't know about the real God either until Jonah told them that he was running away from that God. And they were afraid because they were on the sea, and he said he was the God of the land and the sea. So Jonah was running away from God. Where can you go to run away from God?
Nowhere.
What?
Nowhere.
Nowhere? There's no place you can go Not under, like maybe if you took a submarine down to the deepest part of the sea? No. What if you take a spaceship?
Yeah, closer.
So there's nowhere you can go to get away from God. So it seemed kind of funny that Jonah, who knew about the real God, thought he could do that. But maybe he was just thinking he'd be able to get far enough away so God couldn't make him do what he didn't want to do. Verses 11 through 15, the sea was getting rougher and rougher. So they asked him, "What should we do to you to make the sea calm down for us?" "Pick me up and throw me into the sea," he replied, "and it will become calm. I know that it's my fault that this great storm has come on you." I think that one big storm can be blamed on one person. Well, if it's God's purpose, I guess. Instead, the men did their best to row back to land, but they couldn't because the sea grew even wilder than before. Then they cried to the Lord, "Oh Lord, please don't let us die for taking this man's life. Don't hold us accountable for killing an innocent man, for you, O Lord, have done as you pleased." Seemed like they were taking Jonah pretty seriously, and they were taking his God pretty seriously. But even though they knew, even though these sailors had fake gods and they didn't really know all the right things to do, they knew that killing a man was wrong. Why do you think they still ended up throwing Jonah overboard? That was the only way they could think of to save themselves, and so they were going to give this a try, but they knew killing was wrong, and they were worried that they'd get blamed for it. In 16, when they threw him overboard, or they took Jonah, 15, they took Jonah and threw him overboard, and the raging sea grew calm. At this, the men greatly feared the Lord, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord, and they made vows to him. So, when they did what Jonah told them to, everything was cool. So it really was Jonah's fault. Just like Jonah said, he knew his God. Jonah was a prophet. He was a prophet. He talked to the Israelite kings. He told them that the borders of Israel would be expanded, and they were. But in here, he was called to talk to the Ninevites, and he ran away from God. But you remember how Jonah didn't want to share God's love with the Ninevites? He didn't want to share God's love with people that weren't his people. With anybody that wasn't an Israelite, he didn't want to mess with them. And yet, even though he was running away from the Ninevites, here he told all these sailors about God. And they even believed because they offered sacrifices to him. And they believed enough to throw him overboard. So Jonah didn't do a very good job of being selfish here because God overruled him. Does anybody know what happened to Jonah next?
Yes.
What? What happened to Jonah next? He got swallowed by a big fish, didn't he? All right, verse 17. The Lord provided a great fish to swallow Jonah. And Jonah was inside the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. So we know that there's a whale shark that could swallow people. In fact, there's a video online that shows somebody getting spit out after the shark accidentally grabbed him. It's not the shark with the sharp teeth. It's just called a whale shark. I don't know. Certain whales are big enough that they could hold them in their mouths. And a huge catfish could swallow a person, and a few have, especially if you're a small person. Do you think being swallowed by a fish is a good thing? No? Not on your list of to-dos? Not your bucket list? Why do you think this verse said God provided a fish? Any ideas? Well, what was going to happen to Jonah if he was stuck out in the middle of the ocean? He would have drowned, right? So God provided a fish, not the mode of transportation I would choose. Imagine being in the smelly belly of a fish for 3 days. I probably threw up a couple times. All right. From inside the fish, Jonah prayed to the Lord his God. He said, "In my distress I called to the Lord, and he answered me. From the depths of the grave I called for help." He was talking about being inside that belly of the fish way down in the sea. He called for help, or even being in the water. He was going to die. But sometimes he uses poetry, so it says in the depths of the grave, because he knew he was going to die. He called for help, and you listened to my cry. You hurled me into the deep, into the very heart of the seas. And the current swirled about me. All your waves and breakers swept over me. I said, I have been banished from your sight. Yet I will look again toward your holy temple. The engulfing waters threatened me. The deep surrounded me. Seaweed was wrapped around my head. To the roots of the mountains I sank down. The earth beneath barred me in forever. But you brought my life up from the pit, O Lord my God. At least from the pit of the stomach of that whale or that fish, huh? When my life was ebbing away, I remembered you, Lord, and my prayer rose to you, to your holy temple. Those who cling to worthless idols forfeit the grace that could be theirs. Wow, the grace could be theirs, but they follow idols. Do you think people follow idols today? Some people are so entranced by this idol that they follow it anywhere. Sometimes people follow all sorts of different kinds of idols, don't they? But I, with song of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will make good. Salvation comes from the Lord. Salvation comes from the Lord. And the Lord commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah on the dry land. Imagine if you were standing on the land and some guy come up to you that had been vomited out by a fish. You know what he'd smell like? Not very good. So he was stuck in the fish for 3 days. That gave him a lot of time to think about God, right? A lot of time to think about what he had done. And so how did this experience of getting stuck in the fish change Jonah's heart? Well, it says in the first verse of chapter 3, then the word of the Lord came to Jonah a second time. Go to the great city of Nineveh and proclaim the message I give you. And Jonah obeyed the word of the Lord and went to Nineveh. So what did Jonah do differently this time? He what?
He listened to God.
He listened to God. Okay, he did what God said. He loved the Lord his God with all his heart, his mind, his soul, his spirit. That's the first commandment, isn't it? To love God. But what's the other important commandment? Jesus says that loving God and this other commandment sum up all the commandments. What was that? Anybody in the back? No? Love your neighbor as yourself, right? Well, let's see if he loved the Ninevites as himself. Now, Nineveh was a very important city, in verse 3. A visit required 3 days. On the first day, Jonah started into the city. He proclaimed, 40 more days and Nineveh will be overturned. Wait a second. Oh, yeah, I'm in 3 yet still. Sorry. The Ninevites believed God. They declared a fast, and all of them, from the greatest to the least, put on sackcloth. That's like rags. When the news reached the king of Nineveh, he rose from his throne, took off his royal robes, covered himself with sackcloth, and sat down in the dust. Then he issued a proclamation in Nineveh. By the decree of the king and his nobles, don't let any man or beast, herd or flock taste anything. Don't let them eat or drink, but let man and beast be covered with sackcloth. Let everyone call urgently on God. Let them give up their evil ways and their violence. Who knows? God may yet relent with compassion and turn from his fierce anger, so that we will not perish. Did the people of Nineveh pay attention to God's message for them? Did they? Okay. I think they did. All right. How can you tell? What did it say in there? How can you tell that they believed the message? Well, it says they believed, didn't it? And then they did something too to show that they believed. After they believed, because they believed, they did those things. They showed that they were sorry because they believed. Do you think that would change God's mind? If they believed and then showed that they were sorry, would that change God's mind? It says, when God saw what they did and how they turned from their evil ways, he had compassion and did not bring upon them the destruction he had threatened. How can God do that? It's sort of like he says he's going to do something, then he doesn't do it. Does that make sense to you? Most of the time it doesn't make sense at all, but there's this one kind of thing that you can do, and that's believe in him, right? First 3 verses of 4. But Jonah was greatly displeased and became angry. He prayed to the Lord, "Oh Lord, is this not what I said when I was still at home? That's why I was so quick to flee to Tarshish. I knew that you are a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abounding in love, a God who relents." You know what relents means? It means he changes his mind. A God who relents. He changes his mind when you kind of beg him to. He's a God who relents from sending calamity. Jonah knew this, and he didn't want these Ninevites to have any benefit. So that's why he didn't want to go to Nineveh. He just didn't like those other people. They're not like Israel. They weren't like his people. So what? Why do you think he didn't like God? He didn't like these strangers to get the same kind of benefits that his people would. That didn't make sense to him. He didn't like that. So which of these words about God do you like best? Gracious, compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in love, or relenting from calamity. Which ones of those do you like? You. What's your favorite of those?
There's one in the middle.
Gracious, compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in love, relents from sending calamity.
Slow to anger.
Okay, slow to anger. All right, that's a good one. It's good he doesn't just swat us when the minute that we do something wrong, huh? Imagine if he did that. We'd all be dead. So, God wants Jonah to be like him, right? Because he says in verse 4, "But the Lord replied, 'Have you any right to be angry?'" Do you have any right to be angry? Verse 5, "Jonah went out and sat down at a place east of the city. There he made himself a shelter, sat in its shade, and waited to see what would happen to the city. Then the Lord God provided a vine and made it grow up over Jonah to give shade for his head, to ease his discomfort. And Jonah was very happy about the vine. But at dawn the next day, God provided a worm which chewed the vine so that it withered. When the sun rose, God provided a scorching east wind, and the sun blazed on Jonah's head so that he grew faint. He wanted to die and said, 'It would be better for me to die than to live.' But God said to Jonah, 'Do you have a right to be angry about the vine?' 'I do,' he said. 'I'm angry enough to die.' But the Lord said, 'You've been concerned about this vine. Though you didn't tend it, you didn't make it grow, it sprang up overnight and it died overnight. But here we have Nineveh that has more than 120,000 people who can't tell their right hand from their left.'" In other words, they didn't know anything about God, basically. He said, "Should I not be concerned about this great city?" God uses this vine to teach Jonah a lesson about graciousness, compassion, being slow to anger, being abounding in love, relenting from wanting calamity anyway. Because he's concerned about these evil people in the city of Nineveh. That's why he sent Jonah, to give them a chance to turn to God and to believe him. And God knew they would, and they did. He even sends people to tell people about God if they don't want to believe him. But do you think Jonah learned any lessons from this?
Yeah, probably.
What did he learn? Any ideas? What's that? You can't run away from God. That's one lesson. And I think he learned also that he shouldn't be selfish. You know why I think that? Because he wrote this book about himself. He told everybody that he'd been selfish. And he doesn't even tell us at the end that he became unselfish. He just leaves us to think about it because he wants us to think about our own selfishness, not about his, and about all those other people who need to hear about God that aren't in this church building. All the people that you see everywhere else. So, God told Jonah to go. Jonah said no. The wind began to blow. The sailors tried to row. Then they had to throw Jonah overboard. Then they got to know that God is the real God. God sent a gigantic minnow to swallow Jonah. Jonah's faith began to grow. God told the fish, "Land ho!" And Jonah, the fish, did throw up. God told Jonah again to go. This time he did so. The people of Nineveh got to know God, so the city didn't overthrow. Then a plant began to grow to show God's gracious and compassionate and loving, and God relents, and his anger is slow. All right. Let's go.